Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this IMechE webinar, How to Lead Through Change, Increase Personal Effectiveness and Build a High-Performing Remote Team. My name is Rob Austin-Goodall. I'll be the moderator for this session. My colleague Alison Roberts will be delivering the presentation very shortly. Again, thank you for joining. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself with your name and where you're from in the chat box. If you can't see the chat box on the right-hand side, if you hover over the slide, you'll see some buttons appear at the bottom. If you click on the one that has the speech bubble, that will then open the chat box on the right-hand side, and please type in your message there. Can you also make sure that the selected is to all participants in the to section, just so we can see everything that everyone types. As we go through the presentation, if you have any questions, again, please put them in the chat box as well. We'll more than likely address these at the end to give Alison the time to go through the presentation. So any questions, please address them in there. There'll be some time at the end to answer those. What I'll do now, if I'll scroll through the slides quickly, just to show that to myself and Alison. And what I'll do now is I'll hand over to Alison to start the presentation. Again, thank you very much for attending. Over to you, Alison. Alison, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, so thank you very much for joining us. It's especially great to see so many of you joining from all over the world. So you are very welcome to this afternoon's presentation. What we're going to do is just run through what you can expect from this 30-minute webinar. So the goal is to deliver as much value as possible for you. And as Rob said, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and I will get to those at the end for you. So this is an opportunity for you to find out about the new virtual masterclasses that we're launching. As I said, the aim is to deliver some really strong, actionable tips from selected modules across the 4 programs that you can take away and put to work in your business straight away. It's an opportunity as well for you to have a think about which of the 4 masterclass topics might be best suited to you and your team. And as I said, we'll get to all of your questions at the end. So this is what we're going to be covering today. We're going to be looking at the importance of communication skills and team leadership for the remote manager. And I think that this is especially important given the changes that we've all experienced over the last few months, where most people are now working remotely. And there is a very, very different style of team leadership required when you are managing a remote team. We're going to be looking at performance management and how to set impactful goals. And this is especially useful if you're a first-line manager or you are thinking about moving into management. We'll take a look at resilience. And in fact, I think 57% of recruiters, internal recruiters, are now looking at resilience as a key skill. Likewise, time management in order to help you become much more effective at work. And lastly, we'll be looking at coaching for high performance and how you can build really great teams as a senior manager. And in fact, the whole area of coaching as it applies to you, whatever your position is. So we'll be looking at these critical areas in some depth. So as far as communication skills are concerned, in terms of remote teams, having a clear, focused approach in the way that you communicate is absolutely crucial in terms of leading, engaging, and retaining the motivation of your remote team. So, as I said, we'll be looking at that in some depth. In terms of remote team management, yes, it's very important to make sure that you set impactful and realistic goals. And this is all the more important if you are a new manager. As I said, we'll be diving into resilience, and I'll be giving you some tips on how you can increase your self-awareness and effectiveness, which in turn is going to help you build much stronger relationships with your team. That also has an impact right the way across your personal relationships as well. So some really useful information coming at you as far as that's concerned. And then lastly, not just coaching and supporting you in developing high-performing teams, but some tips on how to manage conflict as well. So let's get started. Okay, I've got a question for you. I'd like to get some idea of why you think communication and strong team leadership are critical skills for successful remote managers. Why do you think that this is important? So just pop your answers in the chat box there. So why communication and strong team leadership are critical skills for remote managers? All right. So some of the notes that I had here as I was busy preparing the material for these masterclasses are things like building alignment, executing strategy. Communication is obviously important to motivate your team around the guiding values and principles of the organization, and indeed your own personal values and guiding themes. I think communication is also really important because it has the ability to strengthen team morale, and especially if you're working with remote and in fact globally dispersed teams, this is really important. So some of the other things that I've got here is that communication builds trust and collaboration within the team, ultimately increases productivity. It can prevent miscommunication and division, and ultimately reduce attrition. So this is also particularly important for any of your team that are interacting directly with your customer base. If your team are not motivated, feel included, and are able to share in your leadership and the organizational vision, the chances are that the way that they communicate is going to impact the customers. That could result in poor customer service and ultimately brand decline. So some of the things that could go wrong as far as not doing some of these things are with miscommunication. You could get incomplete stories from the team. You and the rest of the team might feel that they're not being given or receiving the full picture. And you may find that some of this lack of information flowing back to you can lead you to over or micromanage the team, which is the last thing that anyone wants. Now, some of the reasons that poor communication takes place is that there sometimes isn't enough face-to-face interaction with remote teams, and it means that we're missing out on reading crucial body language and vital clues, which can help us to take the pulse of the team. There are other areas, of course, such as email, team messages, where the real meaning of what we're trying to communicate can get lost. So these are some of the reasons why communication and strong team leadership are absolutely critical. So one of the things that you can do is you can get your team to write a user manual. Now, I'm going to go into that in just a second. And when I was researching this, it prompted some interesting questions. You can and should prioritize video calls. As I said earlier, that face-to-face interaction is absolutely key in order to read body language and take the temperature of your team. I'm going to talk a little bit about reset meetings in a second. I'd like to just talk for a minute or two about the cultural, generational, and communication differences that we need to take into account. So one of the companies that I was working with in a training capacity a while ago had their organization dispersed across 53 different countries. So obviously there was a lot of cultural difference in the way that people communicate. So in this particular instance, there was a senior manager in Eastern Europe and another senior manager in South America. Now, the Eastern European way of communicating tends to be quite direct, whereas in South America, they have a very indirect way of communicating. So they love to find out all about the family and how your friends are doing. And there is a lot more substance to their communication. So what happened in this particular instance was that the person from Eastern Europe would email and say, I need this doing, and this doing. And the person from South America perceived that as being very rude and very condescending. And it actually led to the person from South America handing in their notice. Now, they were able to resolve the problem. And it's just really to make you aware that people communicate in very, very different ways. The same thing applies to generations. I've worked with teams where, you know, somebody in their 30s is managing somebody who is close to retirement. And it's very important to think about how to get the best from the different generations. So, for example, you know, people of an older, you know, who are older, approaching retirement, they have so much knowledge and experience to impart to the team, and yet in some organizations they're overlooked and sidelined. So think how you can involve that older generation in your communication. Think about mentoring, think about reverse mentoring, and think about where that older generation, where they're coming from. They want to know that they're useful, that they're valuable, and that they can contribute. They don't want to think of themselves as disposable and extinct. So make sure that you take the time to include them in your communication and take advantage of the valuable information that they can impart the rest of the team. So this was the user manual that I was referring to briefly earlier. What I found really interesting about it is that I'd never actually asked myself some of these questions. So one of the things that I don't have a lot of patience for are very, very long, involved emails where there is so much content that I need to read it and reread it and try and dissect it. I much prefer short emails, preferably with bullet points. And I realized that this wasn't something that I'd necessarily communicated. So I'm not saying that this is something that you should do. What I'm saying is that this is something worth thinking about, and it's a good way to take the temperature of your team and to get a better understanding of how people can work with you as well. So a team reset, this is something that we actually do regularly at IMechE, and it's incredibly useful. It's, as I said, we do it weekly. What it does is not just help to establish a sense of community, but it helps us to explore any of the challenges that any of us are facing in terms of working remotely. People's situations are very different. Somebody who has a young family is going to be trying to adjust their work to fit around maybe home education, making sure that the kids are, you know, have exercise, whereas somebody who's single is going to be working very, very different hours. So it's important to take these considerations into account. Somebody who's an early morning person, absolutely fine for you to email them and connect at 8 o'clock in the morning. Whereas for somebody who prefers to start work and is at their best at 10 a.m., that would be unacceptable. So these are all things that we need to think about when working remotely. One of the key things is to clarify your expectations. And as I said, this is something that we do weekly. The pace of things and the world that we live in is very, very fluid at the moment. So as you work to get the best from your remote team, please do clarify your expectations as they change. This needs to be an ongoing conversation that you have with not just your management team, but with the team as a whole. And again, projects and priorities are changing. In the evolving situation that we all find ourselves in, make sure that this is communicated to your team and the various stakeholders as well. All right, so let's take a look at the leadership aspect. So as we move forward, these are just some of the key things that you can do to improve communication. And just doubling back slightly.
Alison, you've gone back a few slides. Is that right?
Sorry, 2 seconds. No.
Which slide do you want to get from the leadership slide? There we go.
Yeah. Sorry, let's just. Thanks, Rob. Just bear with me a second. Okay, great. Sorry about that. So, okay, just to summarize the communication side, establish a sense of community within your team. So remote workers can feel isolated. It's very easy for people to hide behind their computers, and it's a lot more difficult for you to identify which people are struggling and with which tasks. So these are all key things that you would need to look at, and to really make sure that you focus on as you begin to develop a more robust communication model with the rest of your team. So thinking more in depth now about the leadership element of today's talk, why is leadership so important? So just put one word in the chat box why you think leadership is really important. Okay, so some of the things that I've got are that it provides clear direction, it helps to demonstrate and set correct behaviors. If you are truthful and transparent with your team, it provides them with a sense of security. If you're a decisive leader, that brings about team confidence. Strong leadership ensures that everyone's voice gets heard. So these are some of the things that I had down. So what I'd like you to do as we move forward throughout the presentation is to think back to a leader that you admired or the kind of leader that you aspired to be. Think about what their defining characteristics are and what actions you can take to embody some of those characteristics as you start to lead your team through the challenges that many people are experiencing, as I said, in today's fluid environment. So these are some of the tips that you can execute. One of the things that I'd like to pick up on is over-communicate, number 4. Don't ever assume that you have communicated enough. This is especially important when you're looking at delegating to people. Make sure that you over-communicate what's required. And this is both laterally and vertically. make sure that you're communicating right the way up and down the chain, and also understand that it's important to take into account the need for people to work flexibly. So if somebody needs to take a couple of hours off in the afternoon and you know, in order to catch up, allow that to happen, and the chances are that they'll start earlier the following morning. Okay. So some of the other things that you can do are you can use a team diagnostic tool. This is incredibly useful because what it does is it avoids you making any assumptions about how the team is doing. One of the great things that this does is it gives you hard data on team performance, and it enables you to draw down the information that you need and make the appropriate changes. Something like DISC is an excellent profiling tool. Again, it takes the guesswork out of the communication process and will support you in improving your communication as well. All right, so let's take a look at performance management for first-line managers and the importance of creating impactful goals. So setting clear expectations is the absolute foundation of performance management. Performance management actually requires two things. First of all, setting clear expectations, and second of all, holding your team members accountable for those expectations. Now, when you're a new manager, that's not always an easy thing to do because sometimes those are very difficult conversations to have with people. So these are some of the questions that would be really useful for you to ask yourself. Do your team members know what you expect from them? Do they know what great performance looks like to you? And when they struggle, are you there to provide guidance and assistance for them where possible? So this comes back to what I was saying earlier about making sure that all the team is included and that everyone has the information that they need to perform at their best. So you can prevent that. You can prevent a lot of problems from occurring by making sure that you communicate regularly. So we talked about, you know, having once a week team meetings, but be truthful, kind, and assertive. These are the things that help to build trust within your team. They also build morale, build unity, always encourage collaboration, and make sure that everyone is aware of what is expected from them on a regular basis, especially as things change. Discover your team's strengths and weaknesses as well going forward. And in that way, you can actually start to not only discover what their development needs are, but start to create development plans. So I just want to highlight the words think elastic here. This is really about encouraging your team to grow, but not taking them so far out of their comfort zone that things become too uncomfortable. So think in terms of a piece of elastic as you start to work in more depth with your team. And just be aware of when they start to contract, they've maybe taken on too much and start to feel overloaded. And when you get the sense that they can take on a lot more, think about which areas they're stretching themselves into and make a note of that in their future development plans. So it's really important to set impactful goals. Let your team know what you want to achieve and set goals at a team level. So one of the things that we do is we set team goals and then let people develop their own goals around those. And these are things that you can check in when you do one-to-ones with the team. Make sure that they are comfortable with the goals that have been set. And if they're working really hard and have managed to achieve all of their deadlines and their milestones, there's always the option there to help support the rest of the team. Most importantly, make sure that you track progress. So the last thing on there is about learning from your mistakes. And we're going to cover this just very briefly when we look at self-awareness. But there's a number of things, a number of questions actually that you can ask yourself when you think about your own development, not just as a first-line manager, but moving through into really senior leadership. These are questions that we need to be asking ourselves on a regular basis. So the questions are things like, what did I do well? Which are the things that I didn't do so well? Where could I improve? What should I keep doing? So these are really key reflective questions that as leaders we need to be asking ourselves on a regular basis. And then making sure that when we set SMART goals for the rest of the team, that we are also applying those same SMART measurements to ourselves as well. So making sure that our goals are specific, measurable, achievable, most importantly, and also realistic. Okay. So any questions on anything that we've covered so far? All right. So let's talk a little bit about developing resilience. So there are 6 really key areas here. And the one that I'm going to focus on today is really all about developing a positive mental attitude. So one of the interesting pieces of research that was led through the University of Kentucky showed that when people face a stressful situation, the adrenaline burst that they get actually increases productivity. It gives their immune system a boost and it helps them to be resourceful and resilient. However, if this happens over a long period of time, people's immune system starts to break down. So one of the key things to remember here is that if you can't change the situation that you're in, to begin to think about how you can change your thinking around it. So having a think about your thinking, what actions can you take to change the way that you think? So some of the things that we can all do is be a lot more mindful of the words that we use. So to use more positive language rather than saying, I can't do this, it's impossible, it's too difficult. Start to listen to yourself, listen to the words that you use when you speak to people, and think, this is difficult, what can I do? What is possible? So these are all small shifts, but as actually happened to me this week, they can make a really, really big difference in the way that you approach your work and ultimately the outcome that you can expect. So some of the other things that you can do is keep focused on the present and accept that things aren't perfect. One of the most useful things that you can also do is to exercise, meditate, and to make sure that you take breaks when you need them. This is particularly important when you're doing very, very focused, intense work. Okay, so let's have a quick look at why time management is so important. So any thoughts on that? Just pop your answers in the chat box. Okay, so these are some of the things that I had down. So ultimately, time management helps you to accomplish more in a shorter period of time. It helps you to prioritize better and to focus. So there are a number of different things that you can, a number of different tools that I'm going to be covering that you can use. But if you do not know how to manage your time better, you're going to experience things such as missed deadlines, higher levels of stress, poor work-life balance, and ultimately burnout. So one of the most useful things that I've done is to create a time audit. That really helped me to look at what I was doing, what I wasn't doing enough of, and to set a time limit to do each task. So I work in 20-minute bursts. Stephen Covey also uses a prioritization matrix, which I found really useful. And I've also learned to get a lot better at delegating. So one of the things that I do to help me to finish tasks that I've begun is when I take my 20-minute break, what I'll do is I'll actually leave the task part way through. What that does is it helps me to pick up my train of thought when I come back after my break. Otherwise, if I'm writing something, it means that if I finish the task, it's then a question of staring at a blank sheet of paper. So stopping halfway through a task is a really useful way to come back after a break. Okay, so these are some of the other things that you could look at doing. We've talked about SMART goals, staying organized. Be interested to know what organized looks like to you, and maybe have a think about one thing that you could do to stay better organized that you could implement later on this afternoon. So one of the things that I do is I make sure that I have all my tools ready before I start work in the morning. At 8:30, my computer is up. I've got a list of everything that needs doing. It's been prioritized. And I've got water, a hot drink. So these are all small things, but they make a really big difference when you start work and sit at your computer first thing in the morning. Okay, so we've looked briefly at time management and resilience. Just want to touch on some interesting research by Fredrickson, and it's called Broaden and Build. It's not actually a theory because it has been proven. Positive emotions broaden your sense of possibility and open your mind. So when you approach tasks with a positive frame of mind, you're going to see possibilities, not challenges. And what this does is it helps you to build. So build new skills and build new internal and external resources and mental pathways, which in turn make you more resilient. So these are really crucial factors, not just in remaining resilient, but increasing productivity. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at coaching. So be interested to know how many of you have had coaching or delivered coaching to other people, and what you think are the two crucial factors in successful coaching relationships. So some of the benefits are that coaching helps you to gain more job and life satisfaction. And satisfaction is actually a key motivating factor in people staying engaged and motivated in the workplace. It helps you to work a lot better with others. And from the point of view of being of demonstrating strong leadership, one of the things that coaching does is it helps you to gauge performance and offer feedback. It helps you to uncover what people's development needs are, and also helps you to guide people through developing new skills and completing tasks. So coaching is very much delivered in short bursts, and the aim of coaching is to support people through a particular challenge that they have, or maybe they're moving into a new role, recently learned some new skills. One of the things that I found coaching really useful for is to help people deconstruct what they already do well. So if you've got a member of your team who is really good at something, you can actually get them to coach one of your other team members. And the great thing about that is that it helps them to not only uncover what they're doing well, but to discover some of the practices and the beliefs that they held unconsciously, which help them to deliver so well in what they're doing. So these are some of the reasons why it's a good idea to coach. And in fact, coaching should always be delivered alongside training as well. One of the reasons for that is that training can become very, very flat if it's not supported with some kind of coaching in order to embed the skills. So who agrees with that? Okay, so these are some of the important things that make a really good coach. So communicating clear feedback with permission. So I put permission in there because it's so important to make sure that we always do ask for permission to give feedback before we give it. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Johari window. And what's really interesting about this is that when we deliver feedback in short bursts with permission, it can really accelerate performance. And it's delivered when someone is really open to receiving. And that really is the key thing as far as delivering feedback. So feedback also needs to be really specific. And when coaching, make sure that you have really well-defined issues that are brought to the table. So make sure that your coaching intervention is really clear before you begin, and that both parties have agreed. The other key thing is to make sure that you agree goals and follow up after coaching, and then measure how performance is being implemented, how change is being implemented, and the impact of that change going forward. So these are some of the skills and behaviors that make a good coach. So one of the key things that I'd like to pick up on here is remembering what was said. So this is really important because people often don't hear themselves. So your job as a coach is to reflect that back to people. So reflecting back, paraphrasing, summarizing, these are all key attributes of a good coach. And also to slow down your speaking so that when you're coaching, it gives the person that you're talking to plenty of time to reflect on what's being said. So when you think about coaching, as I said earlier, perhaps this is something that you've already done. Perhaps you've coached or received coaching. Think back to your experience of being a coach. What worked really well for you? What didn't work well for you? And which one skill would you prioritize and apply going forward? So I don't know if you've heard of GROW, but GROW is a really, really useful measurement model to support the coaching process. And what GROW does is it actually condenses the coaching process into 4 really clear areas. The GROW stands for goal, reality, options, and wrap up. So the kind of questions that you'd ask if you were in the initial stages with the goal would be, what will reaching the goal give you? What do you want to achieve by doing this? How will you know that you've reached your goal? And how do you know that the problem has been solved? So in the reality stage, some of the things that we'd be thinking about are, what's happening to you now? What, when, with whom? And what's the result of that? Why is this particular area a problem? And what concrete examples are you bringing to the table that illustrate the problem? What went well? Is this always a problem? Has this come up before? How did you resolve it in the past? And what are the defining factors? What can you do to make a difference? And what have you done so far? So thinking about coaching questions on the options side, we could think of, what else could you do? What would you do if X particular obstacle didn't stop you? Imagine that you'd already reached your goal. How did you do it? And what if this obstacle wasn't there anymore? Which criteria would you use to evaluate the options? And what are the pros and cons of it? So these are just some of the questions that you could use. And then in the wrap-up, you could ask things like, what exactly will you do to reach your goal and by when? So these are all the questions that you would ask to really narrow down what people are going to do, when by, and what accountability actions you're going to put in place afterwards. So things like, how motivated are you on a scale of 1 to 10 to go for this option? Is there anything that we've missed? What would you need to have a 10? What extra support would you need if you don't have that already? And will it solve any of the underlying problems that we've talked about? So as we look at how to build and sustain high-performing teams, these are some of the really key things that we need to think about. Make sure that you praise your team and recognize effort often. Make sure that you keep them up to date with any challenges or team changes. Make sure that you give them an overview of what's happening within the organization and how the organization are responding to current challenges. Check progress and offer support. Make sure that you create a really healthy working environment for your team. So one of the things that we do is we bond with team socials. We have a TED Talk club, for example. We use Pictionary. And there are a number of different things that I'm sure you're doing as well to keep your team bonded, engaged, and motivated as they're working remotely. So think about what else you could be doing. And in terms of resolving conflict, think about open communication, making sure that your team isn't divided, making sure that everyone has the space to voice their opinion, and that you are doing enough one-to-ones with your team to make sure that you preempt any possible problems down the line. So in a recent Gallup report, one of the key things that people look for is to have meaning and purpose within their role. So I'd like you to have a think about, after today, how you are delivering and how you're ensuring, in fact, that your team do continue to have meaning and purpose whilst working remotely, and how you're checking on that. What kind of conversations are you having with people to ensure that both meaning and purpose are prevalent? So I'd like to quickly summarize what we've talked about today in terms of 3 key areas. The first one is to create a sense of security. So we touched on that briefly earlier, and I think that if you look at the work of people like Sunny Giles, for example, and Maslow, one of the things at the base of both of their pyramids, if you like, is to make sure that people have a sense of security. So there are a number of different ways that we've covered today that you can support your team in doing that. And one of them is to make sure that there is open and transparent communication. The other is to listen and to do more listening than talking. And that when you are talking, to make sure that you ask more questions than you normally would do. So these are questions not just about how people are working, how they're finding remote work, but also questions about what suggestions they may have to improve performance, to improve systems, to improve processes, and listen to the answers that you get. Make sure that you offer really personalized support as well. So one of the things that we're doing is, in order to support you and your learning, is to offer a couple of things that we haven't done before, and that are particularly important, as I spoke about earlier, in terms of embedding knowledge and embedding the kind of learning that you get throughout the kind of masterclasses that we're offering. So one of those is to actually come together at the end of the masterclasses, after you've had a chance to really action some of the topics that we've talked about, come together as a team and post-course really assess how the new information has worked for you, whether you've been able to embed it in your day-to-day, and give you the opportunity to bring any problems that you've had, any challenges that you face to the table, so that we can work through them as a team. We're also offering one-to-one coaching to support you in implementing a lot of the masterclass material, because everybody is different and is going to be responding to different challenges within their business. We talked earlier about SMART goals and how important it is to make sure that the goals that you're setting are SMART, not just for your team, but for yourself as well. So to finish off today, I'd like to ask what action you'll take from today and how you will go about creating a SMART goal from it. So I'm going to hand back over to Rob now, and happy to stay online and address any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Alison. Again, let me just move through a couple of slides just to inform you guys of the up and coming masterclasses. So everything that Alison has gone through is in our 4 masterclasses that we have running on the 12th and 13th of May. These can be booked onto via the IMechE website and training section and the e-learning portal. As you can see, they are 4 90-minute sessions with remote management, first-line management skills, senior management, and personal effectiveness. If you book before the 6th of May, there's a £25 discount, as you can see on the right-hand side. And also, for all courses booked in May, there's 3 months access to the APMG International Change Management Foundation accredited course, but the exam is an additional cost to that. That will be just the course. In addition to that, running them on the 12th and 13th of May. We can run any of these courses specific to your company as an equivalent in company delivery. And again, if you want to contact us regarding that, very much can look at facilitating that for you. The next thing I want to stress is that, again, going onto the institution's online learning portal via the IMechE website and the training tab, you can access all our free webinars that we've done over the last 4 or 5 years. There's some 40 available there, covering a number of topics. They're free. We can also you can also access information about the masterclasses, not only the ones that we're discussing here, but other options, some more technical courses like technical report writing. There's an e-learning collection as well, also qualifications and the diagnostic tools that Alison mentioned earlier. And finally, moving on, what we'll do now is we will look at any questions. And Alison, I have a couple that came through earlier on. Firstly, what is DISC and where can I find out more?
Okay, great. So can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Fabulous. So DISC is actually a profiling tool, and it's something that we use here at IMechE. It's basically a profiling tool divided into 4 separate quadrants. You can find out more about that directly through us. So if you email us at training@imeche.org, we're more than happy to supply you with more information. We also run a full training on DISC as well. What it ultimately will help you to do is 2 things. First of all, gain really valuable insight into yourself and the way that you communicate. And second of all, you can use it with your teams to be able to adjust and calibrate your communication so that it is really directed towards each of your team members.
Excellent. Okay, next one, Alison, is 2 questions basically about over-communicating. When you mentioned to over-communicate, one was, can you over-communicate? And does over-communicating lead to micromanagement?
Yeah, they're both absolutely great questions. So as I was writing it, I was thinking about micromanagement, and they are actually 2 very different things. I think when you are micromanaging someone, you realize that there are some real communication gaps that haven't been addressed. If you over-communicate at the beginning, it means that you're looking to close those gaps. So over-communicating, I guess, means double-checking, over-checking, and then releasing the task for that person to come back to you if you have any questions.
Great, thanks, Alison. Next one, what are the differences between coaching and mentoring?
Okay, that's a great question. So coaching is a much more formalized process, and it's designed to solve a really specific problem, or to upskill somebody. So it basically is so you would come, both parties would come with a very specific goal in mind, really well defined, and coaching would stop once that issue or outcome has been achieved. Mentoring is a much more informal process, and in fact mentoring can and sometimes does last many, many years. And there are a number of different things that a mentor can do. So mentoring might take place so that the mentor can share their network, for example. It might be, mentoring might be done in order to motivate some of your more senior management. So mentoring is a much more informal process and can have it can happen for a number of different reasons and can have a number of different outcomes.
Thank you, Alison. Next one. I'm familiar with the W of the GROW model relating to willingness of the participant. How does wrap-up differ and what does it involve?
Oh, that's a great question. So, yeah, willingness is actually part of the wrap-up process. When you get to willingness, that's where you really assess how effective you've been in the last 3 steps in terms of guiding people towards agreement. And that's agreement that everything that you've discussed so far makes sense, agreement that it's within their scope and their ability, and willingness to actually go ahead, embed the goal and be accountable for it. So they are actually really similar.
One that's come in from Nathan, just now. I often seem to feel ineffective or inactive in a group where I'm a team member rather than when I'm assuming a leadership role. How can you offer advice on this?
That's really interesting. So I probably would need to know a little bit more about that. So just so that I understand your question correctly, it's that you're confident when you're in a leadership role, but you find it more difficult to participate in a group scenario. Is that correct?
I don't know if Nathan's still there. Yes, exactly. He says, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nathan. Yeah. So I think that's interesting because some people are naturally more reflective in a group setting. I know that I'm like that, whereas I'm more outspoken in a leadership role and more reflective in a group setting. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, and I don't think it's a problem unless somebody has perceived it to be a problem. I think one of the things that you can do is actually start to interject more within the meeting. So if you perceive it to be a problem, Nathan, just start to add more, to comment more. But yeah, like I said, I think with that, it would be very much a question of, is it perceived by everybody else to be a problem? If it isn't, I think you're probably absolutely fine as you are. Does that kind of answer your question? I think without a little bit more context, it's slightly more difficult.
Thank you, Alison. Next question is, how do you recommend overcoming higher management skepticism of whether people working from home are actually working from home?
Okay, so one of the things that is really key in that kind of situation is to make sure that output is recorded and measured against goals. So it's not so much how long or people are working, as in are they working 9 to 5, but have they achieved the goals that have been set out, and have they exceeded those goals? So it's really all in the reporting process. So rather than focusing management on how many hours people are working, focus them instead on the successes of the team. Make sure that all of those are recorded, and also, really important, make sure that you're recording and passing up any extra value that the team has brought to the table.
Thank you, Alison. I've got one extra sort of question that I can answer. It's certainly just about the accessing the webinars. It's whether you need to be a member or not. No, you don't actually. Anyone can log on and access the webinars. Whether you're an engineer or non-engineer, there's some wonderful and superb webinars on there that will benefit anyone. And finally, thank you all for your participation in this. Thank you, Alison, for a fantastic webinar, great comments and great feedback from you guys. And thank you, and take a look out for our next webinars that are coming up in the future.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone.